Hello, and welcome to our presentation on cognitive load theory. Our target audience for this presentation is pre-service teachers, but this information should prove useful to any educator with an interest in managing cognitive loads. Today's presentation is a collaboration between myself, Seth Kennard,
Me, Scott Biola.
And me, Sue Song. Before we begin, we would like to note that this presentation attempts to model the best practices for managing cognitive loads. Therefore, some APA citations will not be visible on screen, but are contained in the speaker's notes section of our presentation. You can access these notes in the PowerPoint file that accompanies this video.
To begin, please consider what Dylan William had to say about cognitive load theory on Twitter. The educational researcher says, "I've come to the conclusion that Sweller's cognitive load theory is the single most important thing for teachers to know." If you are not already familiar with cognitive load theory, you might be asking yourself, what is cognitive load theory? Seth, Sue, and I are about to delve into answering that and any other questions you may have about cognitive load theory. We want to help you get a better feel for how this theory can help you optimize learning outcomes for your students. One way to lighten cognitive loads is to give students a graphic organizer at the beginning of a lesson. The organizer that you see here shows how we will break today's presentation into manageable chunks. First, we will ask a central question, and then we will break that question down into smaller chunks. Our central question for today asks, how should teachers manage cognitive loads? Before we can think about managing cognitive loads, we've got to have an understanding of what cognitive load theory is. Let's answer that question. What is cognitive load theory? To understand cognitive load theory, we've first got to understand the concept of working memory. The main thing to understand about working memory is that our working memories can only process about 3 to 5 chunks of information at a time. You might think of a chunk as a consolidated way of perceiving information. You could also say that we can only process 4 plus or minus 1 chunks of information at once. This means that if we present students with, say, 6 tidbits of new information, it's safe to assume that we have exceeded their cognitive bandwidth or cognitive load. As teachers, we are better served to carefully ration the way we present new information. Otherwise, we will exceed the maximum capacity of our students' working memories. Unlike our working memories, our long-term memories can store a potentially infinite amount of information. Given the limited capacity of our working memories, it should be our goal as teachers to help our students encode new information as a long-term memory. There is a rich gets richer effect that tends to happen as our long-term memory stores grow. For students, the information that is encoded as a long-term memory gives them a foundation upon which they can build new knowledge for the rest of their lives. For a quick example to illustrate the power of long-term memory, please solve this math problem in your head. Long ago, you likely encoded the answer to this math equation as a long-term memory. Thinking of 6 times 2 as a single chunk comes in handy when solving more complicated equations like this one. A person who does not know that 6 times 2 is 12 will be forced to devote more cognitive bandwidth than you will to solve the same equation. We are using math examples here, but we know that this also happens when students expand their vocabulary and build automaticity with their ability to recognize words as sight words. Having foundational knowledge within a specific domain, like math or reading, helps us process new information more efficiently. Prior knowledge helps us automatically chunk information that we already know and enables us to devote more cognitive bandwidth to figuring out what we don't already know. Similarly, the more knowledge a person has stored in their long-term memories about any subject, the more readily they can learn new information about that subject. A central goal of managing cognitive loads is to maximize the amount of information that can be stored in our students' long-term memories. This requires paying careful attention to the various bits of information that students are forced to grapple with at any one time. If teachers carefully manage cognitive loads, then their students will have better learning outcomes.
The core recommendation of cognitive load theory is to reduce extraneous load and optimize intrinsic load. In this part of the presentation, I will share instructional recommendations for optimizing intrinsic loads imposed upon students during instruction. So, how do we get more of the good stuff? Intrinsic loads may need to be increased, decreased, or maintained depending on the state of your students' working memory capacity. When your students are cognitively overloaded, even after you already minimize extraneous load and really refine the instruction, it is necessary to decrease intrinsic loads so that students' working memory capacity is fully utilized without being overloaded. When there is spare cognitive capacity available, then increasing the cognitive load, such as covering more content or variations, could improve instructional efficiency, deeper learning, and increase transfer. We can't see how full our students' working memories are in any direct manner, but keep an eye for signs that your students are overloaded, confused, or underloaded, bored, so that you can optimize intrinsic loads through appropriate curriculum sequencing. The first recommendation to optimize intrinsic loads is to deliver a portion of the content you are teaching before the main lesson. This is called pre-teaching. For example, to reduce the cognitive load of a reading task, you can pre-teach vocabulary that students are likely to encounter. In literature or history class, you can pre-teach timelines, characters, and events for added prior knowledge and background that will help students understand big ideas. In math, you can pre-teach relevant skills students will need during a learning activity, such as spreadsheet skills before introducing the main mathematical content. The second recommendation is to break up a task into bite-sized chunks to reduce intrinsic cognitive load. This is referred to as the isolated elements effect. If students are overloaded by too many elements at once, reduce intrinsic loads by providing first a task with a lower level of element interactivity, followed by a more complete task with higher levels. Start by constructing a skills hierarchy to make explicit the interacting elements and segment your instruction to teach each of the skills in turn. You can also consider cutting an element or two to reduce element interactivity, which will allow students to progressively build up an interconnected network of the concepts, skills, or knowledge one interaction at a time. The third recommendation has to do with sequencing and combination of curriculum. There are two approaches you can take: part-whole approach and whole-part approach. Part-whole approach means building segmented skills and knowledge before putting it all together. The part-whole approach can be effective when the individual segments of the task make sense in isolation. The multiple exposures provided by snowballing can give students additional opportunities to embed each of the segments into long-term memory. Whole part approach means providing a general overview first, followed by a more focused practice of individual segments. When taking the whole part approach, simplifying the underlying task so that students can focus on just a few key portions of a task while rehearsing the whole is a great way to reduce intrinsic loads, especially for students in the early stages of integrating a new skill into an existing process. Learners need differing amounts of support depending on their level of expertise. Guided instruction is great for novice learners, but you should gradually remove support and add more independent problem-solving tasks as learners gain expertise. Heavy use of worked examples will become redundant and even counterproductive when learners' expertise increase. So, worked examples are better for novice learners, and problem solving is better for expert learners.
Thank you, Sue. In this next section, we are going to focus on what we can do to cut out the bad stuff and have what we're teaching reach the learner more efficiently. One experience that we all may have had as learners is sitting through a PowerPoint presentation where the presenter displays a bunch of text on the screen and then proceeds to read it to you or talk over it. My guess is that your response to this as an audience member was less than positive. As you will learn, there are a couple of reasons why this doesn't go over well, and they are rooted in cognitive science. Here's a quick example. This is a picture, a diagram of the circulatory system taken out of a medical textbook. What you see are all areas of the system with descriptions next to each area explaining the movement and blood flow. Is this easy to understand? Taking out that redundant information yields a much clearer diagram with the arrows doing the talking and a much easier way for a student to take in the information and not overwhelm the capacity of their cognitive load. For information that is essential to present, it's important to present that information together. We've all seen this diagram of a layout with a picture and text. If you note, the picture is next to relevant text. This requires less load on the brain, less extraneous thoughts to be able to make the association between the text and the picture. Time and space are both extremely important when looking at information you present to the learner. Let's look at this example. Which of these two diagrams is easier to understand? Diagram A or diagram B? If you said diagram B, you are not alone. While the words posted here are important, they add new information that the diagram itself would not have with just a drawing. By putting them next to the labeling parts of the hand, it's easier and less extraneous load for the learner. With diagram A, the learner has to look at the color, find the key, and then associate that back with a part of the hand, where diagram B has it in the correct space and time for less of a load for the learner. Researchers have found that auditory, such as the spoken words I am using right now, and visual text, words that are read, may be processed by similar parts of the brain. It is important to leverage other ways that information reaches the brain, such as through the visual process. While written text may be something processed auditorily, pictures, such as the icons you've seen in this presentation, can be used to support the spoken word. This is called dual channel encoding. So how do we optimize the load? By presenting any oral spoken words with pictures and being careful not to add spoken words to written text, which would be too much information for one channel of the brain and add to that load. Researchers have found that the quickest way to get any well-organized knowledge into your long-term memory is to borrow it from an expert, and this can be done through worked examples. Here's an example of a worked example. On the left, you have a math problem with every step clearly outlined and displayed for the learner. On the right, the student is given a very similar math problem and the direct reference on the left to work from. This is an example of a worked example that lines up clearly with the student task. This can also be done through what's called a faded worked example, where the entire problem and solution is done in the first problem, and additional similar problems are posted for the student with varying levels of completeness. In this example, students are to find errors for unfinished work before eventually doing it themselves completely. You'll note that the requirements for what the students are doing are in direct alignment with the example the teacher gave. So Sue, how should teachers manage cognitive loads?
Well, teachers should optimize intrinsic loads by careful curriculum design and sequencing.
Scott, what do you think?
I think it's also about having less of the bad so that our uptake of the good can be optimized. So you might try to avoid throwing that extra clip art into your presentation if it doesn't really jive with your learning goal.
We want to thank everyone for their attention, and we hope to answer any questions you might have about this important topic We hope it was useful to you in your educational journey.
Thank you.